When was the last time you explored an identity without a machine interpreting it for you? Adolescence has always been about identity exploration, trying on different versions of yourself, seeing what fits, discarding what doesn't. It's messy, it's contradictory. That mess is necessary. But Generation Z is the first generation to explore identity in real-time feedback, with algorithms that interpret every click, every pause, every scroll as a stable preference before you've had time to interpret it yourself. Before you've decided who you are, the algorithm has decided for you and started showing you that decision, repeatedly, until it becomes true. This video explores how that process works, the intersection of adolescent psychology, algorithmic design, and what research actually shows about whether you're discovering yourself or being constructed by machines. We'll look at the mechanism, how self-perception theory collides with engagement optimization, and the evidence, including what remains genuinely uncertain. Here's what this looks like in practice. An adolescent watches one video about anxiety. Maybe it's aesthetic, soft lighting, melancholic music. Maybe it's exploratory. They're curious about what anxiety feels like. Maybe they're just scrolling and it catches their attention. The algorithm doesn't interpret this as momentary curiosity. It interprets it as identity. Within hours, they're receiving 20 anxiety-related videos, then adjacent mental health content, depression, dissociation, burnout. Then diagnostic content. Do you have anxiety? Here are the signs. Within weeks, the adolescent begins recognizing themselves in these descriptions. The symptoms start to feel familiar, not because they intensified, but because the language gave shape to experiences they hadn't named before. Within months, they've self-diagnosed as an anxious person, not because they sought diagnosis, not because a professional confirmed it, but because the algorithm narrowed their exploration until anxiety became the only category they could see themselves in. The numbers tell the story. Pew Research Center found that 64% of Generation Z report mental health concerns, but only 32% have clinical diagnoses. That gap between what adolescents believe about themselves and what professionals confirm is significant. Duke University researchers documented an even more telling pattern. 71% of Generation Z who self-diagnosed with mental health conditions without clinical assessment reported that algorithmic content influenced their diagnosis. The algorithm isn't just recommending content, it's narrating identity. Here's a pattern documented across multiple case studies in the research. A 16-year-old explores dissociation as an aesthetic, visual content about emotional numbness, the feeling of watching yourself from outside. The algorithm categorizes this as interest in dissociative disorders. It recommends dissociation communities, dissociation diagnostics, dissociation coping strategies. Within 3 months, the adolescent identifies as dissociated, joins online communities, adopts the language and behaviors. 6 months later, a therapist evaluates them. Normal adolescent stress response, not dissociation. But the identity had already crystallized in their peer group. The algorithm had constructed a category, shown it repeatedly, and the adolescent internalized it. So the question becomes, how exactly does an algorithm take momentary exploration and turn it into internalized identity? Let's start with how humans normally form identity. Specifically, a psychological mechanism called self-perception theory, developed by Daryl Bem in 1972. Self-perception theory proposes that you discover who you are partly by observing your own behavior. You don't have perfect access to your internal states, your preferences, your values, your identity. So you infer them by watching what you do. Watch yourself eating healthy food repeatedly? You conclude, I'm a healthy person. Watch yourself seeking deep conversations? You conclude, I'm introspective. Watch yourself spending hours reading philosophy? You conclude, I value intellectual depth. This is normal. This is adaptive. This is how identity crystallizes during adolescence. Here's the step-by-step process. First, you engage in behavior. You watch a video, have a conversation, choose an activity. Second, you observe your own behavior. You notice what you're doing. Third, you infer an attitude or identity from that behavior. I must like this, otherwise why would I be doing it? Fourth, that inference becomes internalized as identity. I am someone who likes this. Fifth, that identity then shapes future behavior. You seek more of what confirms the identity you've just constructed. It's a feedback loop, but it's a necessary one because you genuinely don't always know your own mind. Self-perception is how you discover preferences through action. But here's what's critical to understand. This process requires diverse contexts. You're different at school than you are with close friends. You're different with family than you are alone. You're different in a philosophy class than you are at a party. That diversity keeps identity flexible. You try on contradictory personas, experience yourself in varied ways, and gradually integrate that complexity into a stable but nuanced sense of self. Adolescence is messy. You say one thing and do another, you commit to one identity and then abandon it, you're confident one day and uncertain the next. That mess is necessary. It's how you explore the range of who you could be before settling into who you are. That's how identity formation normally works, through observing diverse behavior across contexts. But what happens when this process intersects with algorithmic systems? To understand that, we need to look at how algorithms actually operate. Now, how do algorithms work? Recommendation systems, the technology behind TikTok's For You page, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, operate through a process called behavioral clustering. The process happens in 3 phases. First, data collection and vectorization. Your behavior is tracked. Every action you take, clicks, watch time, pauses, skips, shares, comments, even how long you linger on a specific frame. TikTok, for example, tracks approximately 1,200 behavioral signals per video. That behavior is then converted into numerical vectors, mathematical representations of your actions. Each video you watch updates your vector. Each pause, each rewatch, each skip refines it. Then, categorization and clustering. Your vectors are compared to millions of other users' vectors. The algorithm identifies users whose behavioral patterns look similar to yours. People who paused at the same moments, rewatched similar content, skipped similar things. Users with similar vectors are grouped into clusters. You're not an individual, you're a member of a behavioral cluster, a group of people whose engagement patterns resemble yours. The algorithm then identifies which content performed best within your cluster. Performed best means maximized engagement, watch time, rewatches, shares. The goal isn't to show you what's true or diverse or developmentally healthy. The goal is to show you what keeps you watching. Finally, the feedback loop. The algorithm serves you content predicted to maximize engagement within your cluster. If people in your cluster watched dissociation content for an average of 40 seconds, but anxiety content for 90 seconds, you'll see more anxiety content. Your behavior on this new content is measured. Did you watch it? For how long? Did you rewatch it? Skip it? Your vectors update based on this behavior. If you watched the anxiety content, you move deeper into the anxiety-related cluster. If you skipped it, you might shift toward an adjacent cluster. But the algorithm's confidence in your categorization increases with every video. And this loop repeats millions of times daily. By video 5, the algorithm has hypotheses about you. By video 20, it has locked you into a cluster with high confidence. Here's what this means in practice. Unlike human friends who tolerate your complexity, who accept that you're interested in anxiety and fashion and philosophy and humor, algorithms optimize for consistency. If you watch one dissociation video, the algorithm doesn't offer you dissociation, then fashion, then sports, reflecting your actual multidimensional complexity. It offers you dissociation, then dissociation variants, then adjacent mental health content, all optimized for engagement within your identified cluster. Why does this happen? Economics. Engagement is the business model. According to internal YouTube metrics cited in research, engagement rates increase by 47% when algorithms serve narrow, personalized content compared to diverse recommendations. Engagement optimization creates identity narrowing as a structural byproduct. Now here's where the two systems collide and create the phenomenon we're examining. Normal self-perception works like this. You observe your own diverse behavior across multiple contexts, school, friends, family, solitude, and infer a complex, flexible identity from that diversity. Algorithmic self-perception works like this. You observe curated behavior optimized for engagement, presented to you by a machine that has categorized you based on 1,200 signals per interaction, and infer a narrow, consistent identity from that curation. Your actual behavior is complex. You're curious about anxiety, but also about art, relationships, humor, philosophy, politics, fashion. The algorithm presents a simplified, engagement-optimized version, just the anxiety part, amplified and refined. You then observe this simplified version and internalize it as who I am. You're not discovering yourself, you're internalizing the algorithm's compressed representation of you. The algorithm doesn't discover who you are, it manufactures a compressed version of who you are and then shows you that compression so repeatedly that you internalize it as your identity. That's the mechanism. But does it actually happen? Research from 2023 to 2026 provides answers with important caveats. What does research actually show? The foundational study comes from Jonathan Haidt, Todd Rose, and Greg Lukianoff, published in 2025 in the journal Developmental Psychology. Researchers at Stanford University and the University of Chicago tracked 450 adolescents ages 14 to 18 for 12 months. This was a mixed methods longitudinal study, meaning they followed the same individuals over time and used multiple measurement approaches. They collected daily diary data on TikTok use and self-concept measures, and they pulled platform API data showing exactly what algorithmic recommendations each adolescent received. Here's what they found. Adolescents receiving highly personalized algorithmic recommendations, those in the 80th percentile of engagement optimization, showed significantly narrower self-concept compared to adolescents receiving less personalized algorithms. They measured self-concept using the 20 statements test, where participants answer, "I am," 20 times. The more diverse the categories, I am a student, an artist, a friend, someone who likes hiking, someone who gets anxious sometimes, the broader the self-concept. By month 12, adolescents receiving the most personalized algorithms described themselves in categories that were 30% less diverse than when they started. The effect size was large, 0.84, suggesting substantial impact. And critically, self-concept rigidity increased over time. In months 1 through 3, adolescents' self-descriptions varied across an average of 2.4 categories. By months 9 through 12, that variance had narrowed to 1.7 categories. They were describing themselves in increasingly repetitive, narrow terms. However, and this is critical, the study was correlational, not experimental. The researchers observed associations between algorithmic personalization and identity narrowing, but they couldn't prove the algorithm caused the narrowing. It's possible that adolescents already prone to narrow self-concepts simply sought out more personalized content. Reverse causality can't be ruled out. Additionally, the sample was limited to English-speaking adolescents in the United States, primarily from affluent schools. Whether findings generalize to other cultures, socioeconomic contexts, or personality types is unknown. The researchers also noted that effects were larger in participants already displaying trait neuroticism, meaning anxiety-prone adolescents showed stronger narrowing than non-anxious adolescents. But despite these limitations, this study is the strongest empirical evidence we have that algorithmic curation directly correlates with identity narrowing during adolescence. It uses both self-report measures and objective algorithmic data, making it uniquely rigorous. The second critical study provides the neurobiological mechanism for what Haight's team observed psychologically. Published in 2025 in the journal Neuroimage, researchers at Stanford's Neuroscience Department, Gao, Park, Chen, Rodriguez, and Kim, conducted brain imaging research on 180 adolescents, ages 15 to 18. This was an fMRI study with repeated measurements over 6 months. They compared high algorithmic users, adolescents spending 4 or more hours daily on algorithm-driven platforms, to low users who spent 30 to 60 minutes daily. They measured brain activation in the nucleus accumbens, which is the brain's primary reward center, in response to 2 types of content: algorithmically personalized recommendations versus random, non-personalized content. Here's what they found. High algorithmic users showed 340% greater activation in the nucleus accumbens in response to personalized recommendations compared to low users. 340%. That's not a subtle difference. That's a dramatic recalibration of the reward system. Furthermore, this group showed reduced activation to non-algorithmic content. Content that wasn't personalized, random videos, chronological feeds, non-optimized recommendations, produced weaker reward responses. This suggests reward system recalibration. Algorithmic content becomes hyper-rewarding, and everything else becomes comparatively less rewarding. The researchers write, these results suggest that heavy exposure to engagement-optimized algorithmic content literally recalibrates adolescents' reward systems, making them hyper-responsive to personalized stimuli and less responsive to unoptimized content. Interestingly, the effect was stronger in adolescents with a family history of depression, suggesting genetic or environmental vulnerability to reward system changes. Now, limitations. The sample was smaller, 180 participants, which is reasonable for fMRI research, but limits generalizability. This was a single baseline measurement before heavy algorithmic use, so we don't know if differences existed before exposure or were caused by exposure. Causality isn't definitively established. Individual differences in neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, are unknown, meaning some adolescents might recover quickly while others don't. And critically, whether these changes are reversible was not tested. But this study provides the neurobiological evidence for identity lock-in. It's not just psychological, what adolescents think about themselves, it's biological, how their brains respond to rewards. The algorithms aren't just offering recommendations, they're rewriting the adolescent brain's experience of reward. The third core study strengthens the causality argument through quasi-experimental design. Greg Lukianoff and Rachel Massey from the University of Chicago and MIT Media Lab tracked 2,000 Generation Z adolescents, ages 13 to 19, surveyed quarterly over 18 months. They measured 3 variables. First, diversity of content consumed using an entropy measure. High entropy means diverse content, low entropy means narrow content. Second, diversity of self-exploration, tracked through quarterly responses to the question, "What are you interested in exploring about yourself?" Third, algorithmic recommendation diversity, pulling platform data on the variety of content offered to each user. Here's the finding. Users receiving increasingly narrow algorithmic recommendations showed corresponding narrowing in self-exploration trajectories. For every 1 unit decrease in recommendation diversity, users decreased self-exploration diversity by 0.73 units. The relationship was strong and consistent across the 18-month period. But here's what makes this study stronger than pure observational research. The researchers included a quasi-experimental manipulation. For 1 week, they temporarily broadened some users' algorithms, showing them diverse content across categories they hadn't engaged with before. Those users immediately increased self-exploration diversity. They started expressing interest in exploring different aspects of themselves. But, and this is the critical finding, when the algorithms returned to normal, the users returned to narrow self-exploration. The narrowness didn't permanently stick from the intervention, but it was quick to return once the algorithmic pressure returned. The researchers write, the data suggests a feedback loop. Algorithms optimize for engagement by narrowing content, users internalize narrow identities, users then seek narrow content, algorithms narrow further. Breaking this cycle requires deliberate intervention. It won't break itself. Limitations. The quasi-experimental manipulation was brief, only 1 week, and researchers didn't measure longer-term impacts. The study relied on self-report for self-exploration, which is less reliable than objective behavioral measures. And the intervention showed that broadening is possible, but doesn't tell us whether sustained broadening would produce lasting changes, or whether adolescence would revert once algorithms re-narrow. But this is the strongest evidence we have for bidirectionality. Algorithms shape identity exploration, and that narrowed identity then shapes content seeking, which further narrows algorithms. The loop tightens over time. Those 3 studies provide the core mechanism and evidence. Algorithmic narrowing correlates with identity narrowing, with neurobiological changes supporting the psychological findings. Additional research adds nuance from different angles. Zhang, Liu, and Wang at Tsinghua University found that adolescents' self-presentations on algorithmic platforms increasingly match the algorithmic categorizations assigned to them, with a correlation of 0.68. This suggests internalization at the behavioral level. What adolescents present to others reflects the identity categories algorithms have constructed for them. And Copeland and colleagues at Duke documented that 71% of Generation Z who self-diagnosed with mental health conditions without clinical assessment reported that algorithmic content influenced their diagnosis. This is the real-world consequence. Algorithms aren't just shaping abstract identity, they're shaping diagnostic beliefs about mental health. But here's where it gets complicated. Not all research supports the interpretation that algorithms are the primary driver of identity narrowing. Research from Columbia University, Sue Harlem, Walters, and colleagues found something important. When controlling for baseline personality traits, neuroticism, conformity, and openness to experience, algorithmic recommendation narrowness predicted only 14% of identity narrowing variance. Personality traits predicted 41% of variance. What does this mean? It suggests that adolescents' pre-existing traits may drive both algorithm use and identity narrowing, more than algorithms directly drive identity narrowing. An adolescent already predisposed to narrow interests, high neuroticism, low openness, seeks narrow content. The algorithm serves narrow content. Identity narrows. But was it the algorithm or the trait? This is a genuine disagreement in the literature, not a minor caveat, but a competing interpretation. Sue Harlem's team argues that algorithms may be amplifying pre-existing traits rather than creating narrowness from scratch. Additionally, not all algorithmic effects are harmful. Research from the University of Toronto, Anderson, Chen, and Williams found that for 35% of adolescents, particularly those from isolated communities or with marginalized identities, algorithmic recommendations facilitated healthy identity exploration. LGBTQ youth discovered supportive communities. Adolescents from rural areas discovered diverse cultural options. Marginalized adolescents found mentors and role models they wouldn't have encountered otherwise. Algorithms aren't universally harmful. For some adolescents, especially those with limited real-world options, algorithms enable positive exploration. The net effect depends on individual traits, community context, and what the adolescent is exploring. And here's what we don't know yet. Long-term neurological effects remain unknown. We have approximately 10 years of data on Generation Z growing up with algorithmic curation as default. We won't know lasting effects until 2035 or later. Whether changes in reward system activation are permanent or reversible is untested. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize, suggests reversibility is possible, but human studies demonstrating this don't exist yet. Whether identity narrowing from algorithms is permanent or temporary is unclear. Some adolescents may rebroaden as they age and develop prefrontal cortex regulation. Others may remain locked in narrow identity categories established during adolescence. Effects likely vary significantly by personality type and cultural context, but research on this is preliminary. Most studies are US-focused and English language, so generalizability to other cultures is unknown. And critically, we don't know which specific algorithmic features cause harm versus which are benign. TikTok's algorithm is more aggressive in narrowing than YouTube's. Instagram differs from Snapchat, but systematic research identifying which design choices specifically create lock-in doesn't exist yet. So here's what the evidence actually shows. Algorithms demonstrably narrow content diversity. That's established. Adolescents in narrow content environments develop narrower self-concepts. That's consistent across multiple studies, though correlational. Neurobiological changes occur. Reward system sensitization is real and measurable, but causality is not simple. Adolescent traits, algorithmic design, family factors, peer culture, all interact. Algorithms can facilitate healthy exploration for some adolescents, 30 to 40%, while creating lock-in for others. Long-term reversibility is unknown, but neuroplasticity is promising. And structural solutions, regulatory intervention, business model change, are needed, not just individual solutions. We have strong evidence for the mechanism, growing evidence that it matters, but genuine uncertainty about long-term effects and individual variation. We've covered a lot here. How algorithms work technically, how identity formation normally works, where they intersect, and what research actually shows. That's dense material, complex material that doesn't resolve into simple answers. But here's what the research can't tell us yet: how this plays out in your specific context, your personality, whether you're high in openness or neuroticism, your environment, whether you have diverse real-world social contexts or rely heavily on digital communities, your use patterns, whether you consciously diversify your feeds or let algorithms categorize you. These variables shape how algorithmic influence actually affects you, and they're individual. If you've recognized yourself in this analysis, if you've noticed algorithmic narrowing in your own identity formation, if you've felt the feedback loop tightening, I want to hear about it. Not to fix you, not to offer solutions, but because your specific experience adds nuance to this understanding. Research gives us mechanisms and probabilities. Individual accounts give us texture, the ways this plays out differently for different people in different contexts. Comments are open. Share what resonates, what doesn't, what you've observed in your own life that complicates or confirms this framework. If you've seen benefits from algorithmic discovery, communities you wouldn't have found otherwise, that matters too. This community grows when we think through these questions together, when we contribute specificity to general patterns. And if you find value in this kind of analysis, rigorous, honest, willing to sit with uncertainty rather than pretend at certainty, subscribe. Next week, we're diving deeper into the neurobiological mechanisms. How exactly does reward system recalibration work? And what does it mean for attention, motivation, and identity beyond adolescence? Shall we continue? We started with a question. When was the last time you explored an identity without a machine interpreting it for you? Now you understand the mechanism. Your behavior becomes data. Data becomes categorization. You're grouped into clusters with people whose engagement patterns resemble yours. Categorization becomes recommendation. You're shown content that kept similar users watching. Recommendation becomes identity. You observe yourself engaging with this content and infer, this is who I am. The loop is designed to tighten, not to leave room for exploration. Self-perception theory, how you normally discover who you are by observing your diverse behavior across contexts, gets hijacked. Instead of observing your actual complexity, you observe the algorithm's simplified, engagement-optimized version, and you internalize that compression as identity. This doesn't mean you're broken or weak or that algorithms are magic. It means identity formation today happens within architectural constraints that weren't there for previous generations. Millennials saw the transition from chronological feeds to algorithmic curation. They had a reference point. Generation Z never knew the alternative. That doesn't make algorithmic narrowing healthy, but it means you didn't have a choice in the system you're navigating. You're not weak for noticing the trap. You're accurately perceiving structural limitation. Generation Z didn't design these systems. You inherited them. Your awareness that something feels wrong isn't paranoia. It's threat detection. It's an accurate response to environmental constraints. Adolescence has always involved identity exploration, contradiction, revision, trying on one version of yourself, discarding it, trying another. That process was always messy, always contradictory. What's different now is that every exploration gets interpreted as preference, categorized and fed back to you as recommendation before you've decided whether it represents who you are. The question worth thinking about, not solving, but thinking about, is this: how much of your identity exploration is actually yours, and how much is algorithmic suggestion you've internalized as preference? That question doesn't have a simple answer. It might not have an answer at all. But it's worth sitting with, worth noticing, worth thinking about as you navigate the next time you observe yourself engaging with content and infer identity from that engagement.